Hi, and welcome to my talk, Drawing the Line on Content Localization, How Much is Too Much?, presented live at GALA 2018 in Boston. So this talk represents a journey that I set out on. I set out on this journey because I didn't know the answer to this question, how much is too much content localization? But I knew it was very important and strategic to our business. I'm on the product leadership team for Snagit, which is one of TechSmith's two flagship products, and I serve as the strategy lead for that product. And Snagit, my product, is in English and German, and Camtasia, which is our other flagship product, is in English, German, and Japanese. And we have some ambitious goals to grow internationally. We have a new CEO as of a couple years ago, and we really want to grow globally. But of course, that's not the only ambitious goal we have, right? Many companies share this as well. And so we have to make some practical decisions and some real trade-offs in terms of where to invest and how to prioritize those investments. So recent examples of this include, do we reduce the number of help articles to make it easier to localize them? Or should we stop including language-specific UI in our screenshots in our localized documentation? Right? Or maybe we should delay or even cut scope of a major release so we can put more effort and more investment into making product localization more efficient. So these are all the kinds of questions that we have to wrestle with on the product side. So in this talk, what I really want to share is what I learned through a series of interviews and desk research that will help me navigate those decisions and hopefully help you as well. So, and I know that we have a lot of LSPs as well as some clients who will be watching this. And so for the LSPs, I think what this provides is really the peek into the mind of a product manager who's working through how do I balance localization against other investments, other things we could do like add new features to the product. And perhaps it will help you speak my language, the product manager's language, when you're selling your services to someone like me. And you may be able to also help your clients kind of arrive more quickly at a rational, strategic framework for decision making. And that's really a way to add value and go beyond, obviously just doing translation and localization, but sort of helping get the right strategic framework in place. So who are my sources? I talked to a number of localization and content strategists at companies of various sizes and number of languages that they supported. And these were in industries that ranged from security software to 3D software and from telecom to mobile gaming. And I also talked with some folks that serve as localization consultants. And so since they work with a lot of companies, it was great. They could kind of speak to the commonalities between some of these companies and how they do things. The GALA resources on the website were fantastic. Everyone, obviously who attends a GALA conference probably knows that the case studies and information posted there in blog posts is really a great resource. And then the third resource that I leaned heavily on was Anna Schlegel's book, Truly Global, which was published in 2016. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. It's really practical and really detailed on sort of how she approached things. So before I get into the meat here, let me just give you a couple of really quick observations from my conversations, things I sort of gleaned at a high level. So first off, turns out, not surprisingly at all, that people's strategy is closely guarded, right? So most of the interviewees said, I'll talk to you, but it has to be anonymous. You can't use my company name, so you're not going to see any logos that I can share from the people that I talked with, unfortunately. The second thing, and maybe you've seen this too, is that in this industry, there's like no end of information about tactics and operational details and how do I optimize my process of localization, how do I make things more efficient, reduce spend, increase quality, all good stuff, but that's all super tactical and it's really hard to find anything that's very useful on strategy. And, working on the product side of things like I do, we really have to ask ourselves this question first, which is why would I do something? Who is it for and what problem does it solve? I heard someone say, the definition of insanity is working really hard to make more efficient something that you shouldn't be doing in the first place, right? So we all want to avoid that trap. And what happens is that a myopic focus on tactics can sometimes mean that nobody's really measuring the effectiveness and the impact on business outcomes, which means it's pretty easy to cut the budget for things like localization when things get tight. Or, if you want to do some big new innovation like doing video localization, it's hard to find budget for it if you're really wrapped up just in the tactics. So I'm really going to focus in this talk on strategy. And then third, obviously there's not just one approach, not just one silver bullet. A lot depends on your own context, your customers, the market situation you find yourself in. So what I'm going to try to provide here is some guiding principles, some common themes that came out of these interviews, and what you can learn from the experience of others to apply to your own situation. So I'll give you my 3 key takeaways right up front. And that's really start with strategy and get that set before getting tactical. Turns out, and this is one of the things that I found to be surprising, there are many depths of localization you can go to. It's not one size fits all. And then third, a good principle here is just how to experiment and measure to learn what's right for your audience, because I think ultimately that's going to be part of your approach. All right, so let's dive right in. First off, first principle here is really defining a global market strategy. So don't do the same thing for all the different tiers or levels of your markets, but prioritize among them. So your global market strategy, right, is bigger than your localization or your content strategy. So it has to come first. It has to be larger than the other. But then that provides really a framework from which your localization prioritization can happen in a logical way. So you'll decide what to localize based on how you're approaching each market and the level of importance of each market. Obviously, it doesn't tell you, exactly which articles to localize into which languages, but it certainly helps inform those decisions so that the strategy really maps all the way up and is in alignment all the way to the top. Another principle is really thinking in terms of kind of a refinement of this is thinking in terms of these tiers and then the investment level and the entitlement. So this is a quote from Anna Schlegel from her book. She says, ideally, your company has a model that explains which countries deserve what entitlements, and this includes which countries will have things like a call center in the primary language, localized products, a comprehensive digital presence, globalized partner programs, right? So again, these are things that go well outside of just localization, but really help define how you're approaching these markets in general and what is the right approach for each one. And so most companies that I talk to have 3 tiers on average. My company has more than that, and we sort of split, into A1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. But, however you end up doing it, simple is probably better. But usually it's about 3 sort of tiers that you want to define in terms of all your different global markets. And then, you'll see some companies that they align their global investment with for each country with the size of the existing customer base in a country, possibly the market penetration, or maybe even their projecting revenue. I think over the next 5-10 years, we think we can get this kind of growth. And so therefore, we need to invest at this sort of level to get that. For an industry like ours, we look at things like piracy rates, right? Which is, in a software business, piracy is a factor. So how much can we really expect to grow revenue from a particular country? What is the path to the customer that we might take in different global markets? Or are we going to be e-commerce first, or are we going to be channel partners first, in terms of where we see the opportunity for a different country? So if you're just starting out, though, I don't want to overcomplicate things. I would say just really try to get a handle on your company's current reach into various countries. So what are your top 3-5 countries or geos that you serve? Where are you successfully selling? And how are you achieving that success today? What's really working well? And then which countries do you think have the most potential for growth? And just even listing those out, I think, is a great place to start. So this principle came through loud and clear from a number of people I talked to, and that is whoever owns global growth needs to be involved pretty heavily in questions of content localization. So I talked to someone at a 3D software company, and he said, well, in our case, it's the product teams who decide because it's a very product-driven company, and the localization actually comes out of their budget. So obviously they're going to have a big role in it. At a security software company, they said, we're a partner-driven company. And so our requests come in from the field, and different field offices will kind of make a pitch, and they'll say, we think we can grow this much profitability or this much revenue if we get this much budget for localization. At a mobile gaming company, it was their CMO who decides. And in their case, localization is really considered a marketing expense. So obviously it kind of maps up to the CMO. So whether or not, the person who's responsible for growth is the one who develops the whole strategy for localization, they at least need to understand and approve what the priorities are. So involve them and make sure that they are really supporting you and that they believe in what you're doing. Because localization ought to be a growth driver. Like, frankly, that's what it's there for. And so they should be interested in supporting that. So next principle that came out of these interviews and research was trying to use data to set these localization priorities as much as possible. So I talked with, again, a mobile gaming company, and they said, we often just kind of get a quick and dirty idea of how we're doing in different countries by looking at installs. Where are the installs coming from? What percentage from each country or each geography, each app store. And then he said, well, over time we've tried to mature our practice, and we're actually getting a data scientist, and we're getting some analytics software. Now we can dig deeper, and then you can start to see trends like, what is the user age range, where we have the most success? And okay, well, how many people in that user age range can we reach in country B, C, and D? What are the device language settings that tend to correlate best with conversion or downloads? Looking at some of those kind of deeper analytics. And then really taking that and trying to say, well, what is our projected growth? And looking at trends in revenue and trial signups, and then trying to project those into the future. So using some of those data points to really inform the decisions around localization can go a long way towards making it feel like, you've got a real kind of rational approach. This is an interesting one that came out in some of the conversations, which is even if you aren't the person who sets the strategy, at least know the strategy. So if you tend to have a very tactical role and you're operational primarily, it doesn't matter. You can still look at that data that you're working with and the projects that you're working on much more intelligently if you look at them through this lens of what is our strategy? What are we really trying to accomplish? And in some cases, you can identify opportunities where you can actually add more value than you would if you were just executing the operational pieces. So I was talking to someone at a digital signage software company, and he said, we noticed that suddenly our hits on our YouTube videos went way up. Hits from Madagascar went way through the roof. And Madagascar is not one of our big markets. So this sparked a conversation with the sales team. They started to investigate to say, hey, is there more opportunity here than we think? Why are we getting these views? Who are they coming from? And by the same token, he said that they ended up adding Spanish and French video subtitles onto their YouTube videos because they started noticing that they were getting more views from those countries. So it seemed, like it would be a logical investment. So even if you don't get to set the strategy and direct everything, knowing what that is will help you add value as you see new opportunities that could just pass by. So this is, maybe table stakes for where you're at, but I think it's a good reminder that a lot of stakeholders in a company simply don't know how much content has been created. What are we even talking about when we say, localize into this other language? So tallying up that content, identifying owners, is it sales, service, or support that owns that content? Whose is it? Then you can know who to talk to about whether to keep it or chuck it. Evaluating what's outdated. Maybe it's not relevant at all for this new market. Maybe you've got, 500 pieces, but 300 of them are actually some obsolete marketing campaign or support content that just doesn't even apply today. So trying to, trim down that list a little based on just kind of a logical, swipe of stuff that you can, just chunk off and not have to worry about. Similarly, and I thought this was an interesting suggestion, was probably when that content was created, there may have been an ROI calculation or some kind of a business case that was made just to create the domestic content, the content in the source language. And so if you can find that, that may help give you some clues as to like, oh, is this worth doing for for a global market? So this is an idea that really comes also from kind of the product side, and I really love this because it's an approach that I think just really helps us get past inertia. And the lean startup movement popularized this concept of the minimum viable product. And a lot of people think it's about doing more with less. That's actually not the point of it. The point of it is de-risking an idea through quicker build, measure, and learn cycles. So what are all my hypotheses and assumptions about this market, let's say? What do I think are the riskiest ones, where if I'm wrong, it's going to be the most costly and challenging? And then what kind of experiments can I build very quickly and launch so that I can test those hypotheses, those risky hypotheses first? And the whole framework here is based on this idea that faster learning will reduce wasted time and money. And I have here a link I've got some bit.ly links throughout this talk where you can pull those up, and it'll go directly to an article. So this first one is an article that sort of gives a nice primer on the lean product, lean startup, lean product concepts. And if you're not familiar with it, that may be a great place to start. But here's an example of what I'm talking about. So maybe there are the factors that are most likely to impact the adoption rate of your product in another country or geo, maybe they have nothing to do with language, right? Maybe they're actually technical limitations like the hardware that people have there, or their internet speeds, or how penetrated broadband is, what OS versions people are on. Maybe they're typically on OS versions that your product doesn't even work on if it's software. So those can be maybe the key friction points that you want to go at and test, and see whether those are really the biggest issues. With TechSmith, again, it's things like maybe just the piracy rates or our currency and exchange rates. Are they going to work for people in various countries? Do they make our product, out of reach, out of league? So it might be pricing issues and not language issues. So how can we test that? The second link goes to a really great article, a blog post from Miguel at King. And actually, he was the one person who gave me permission to use his company. So when I talk about mobile gaming, that was King. And Miguel has this really great post that if you follow that MVL link, you'll get there. And it's this concept of the minimum viable localization, MVL. And so he describes how some of what they do is taking an approach where you might localize only some of the content and not the product itself at all, right? And then get the product listed in the local marketplace, the app store for that country. And then if you get enough traction, then you can maybe invest more and localize either more of the content or localize the product. But it's sort of what's the minimum that we need to do to to remove barriers to people to adopting our product, and how quickly can we do that? Another idea along those lines is if you're launching a brand new product, maybe try beta testing it in a secondary market that actually shares some characteristics with other markets. And you can even A/B test and say, did having localized content in this market impact our revenue there? And then apply those findings as you roll out to other locales. So, South America is an example that comes to mind there. Before you go big, kind of go small and do some testing to see what you really need and find those barriers. All right, so next up, in terms of findings, defining a core set of content. So I think this was illustrated well by a conversation I had with someone at a security software company. He was saying that they had actually gone through and identified 100 knowledge base articles, support articles, that are the most effective for resolving 80% of issues, kind of heading off issues that would become support cases. So, support avoidance, basically. And so whenever a geo manager or whatever wants to say, hey, I want to go after this country or this geo, they say, okay, great, but you need to get budget to localize 100 KB articles, and that's sort of your minimum core set. Interestingly, they have a very a pretty robust way of measuring the impact of those articles by looking at things like how many tickets were actually deflected because a ticket was started and then an article was suggested and then no ticket ended up being submitted. Time on page metrics, a feedback widget, surveys, etc. So they really did a lot to nail those 100 articles and figure out that those are the ones that they really needed that were most effective. So a great metrics-driven approach to doing that. And then I talked to a digital strategist for e-commerce, and she said, often it's just a really simple matrix, right? Helps us define what the core set is. And they do importance, quadrant, basically importance on one side and shelf life on the other. And then things that are, high importance and long shelf life obviously do, and things that are in the other three quadrants or the other, the two other corners maybe think about, but things that are not important and have a short shelf life definitely don't do, or at least put down, lower on the list. So defining a core set of content, pretty key concept. And really, one approach you can take is just like a content strategist would do for a domestic market, where your source content is coming from, kind of develop global marketing personas and then build out journey maps and then try to fit your content to that map and do that on a market by market basis across the globe, or at least your top tier. So this is like I said, this is exactly what you would do if you're approaching a domestic market. Who are we going after? Kind of what's different about the different groups or segments? Where do they sort of enter our funnel or the journey? What are their critical paths through it? And those points, and then how do we align the content to that journey, either by type of content or actually a list of all the pieces of content. They should sort of map over. And then what you're really looking for is there something different about this geography than our last one? And if not, just use the same approach and this whole same content strategy. But if there are differences, then that's where you'd want to bend that a little bit to work better in that particular geography. And from that, you can really then, develop these content tiers. So here's a quick example of how this looks. We went through an exercise like this recently for TechSmith. It actually was partly mapping satisfaction levels onto this whole customer journey as well. But you see, kind of the persona at the top. You see some stages in the middle here. And then you see at the bottom, here's what pieces of content are down there. Obviously, this was a working session, so they were actually taking sticky notes to say, oops, we forgot some pieces of content. This is other key stuff. And then a really kind of critical path through that, which we think is sort of, the most common path based on analytics that you're gonna walk through that. So this is an area that really was a surprise to me. And if you're in this space, maybe it's not a surprise to you if you've been doing this a while. But, from my seat, I kind of assume that a lot of these decisions are kind of a binary decision, right? So either we do this whole set of content in this other language using expensive human translation, or we don't enter that geo at all, right? So, hey, if we're going to have, Korean, we need everything in Korean and all has to be really perfect. Turns out there's a lot more levers than that you can pull now, and companies are doing that. So as I talk to different companies, they really describe taking a much more nuanced approach and really trying to match the appropriate quality level for different geos and different languages and different content types, with the goal being you don't want to over-optimize on quality because it's just there's diminishing returns there. So I talked to someone at a digital signage software company that I mentioned, and some examples that he cited was, they're a Montreal-based company, and so he said, for our French content, auto-translation is absolutely not acceptable. It has to be high-quality human translation. But for their Spanish audience, he said, we use Upwork, and it's good enough, and we don't sweat the quality as much. People seem fine with it. And then in their case, they have a Chinese employee who does the actual translations into Mandarin, someone on staff. And that's simply because they have to work back and forth across the Great Firewall. And so it's just a very pragmatic, practical approach. Similarly, at a mobile gaming company at King, they serve a lot of Scandinavian countries. And Miguel said, yeah, our product, the in-game content is often fully translated, but the blog posts and tweets are not. And then in other markets, they're just left in English. And then in other markets, there's maybe a mix of localized content and machine translation in English. So there's this kind of mix that is really practical again. I talked with a digital strategist for e-commerce who said that in countries where they have a local presence, like a field office, people on the ground, the headquarters might author about 80% of the content that gets localized. And then about 20% is actually just trans-created content, especially things like blog posts and social posts, that's created by the local team. So they have the basic messages, the basic outline of what they're trying to accomplish, and then that team can just create it from scratch. So there are lots of options available, and I think it's a good time right now to take a very strategic and needs-driven approach because of all these options that are available. Of course, there's always this fear, right? And this fear is like we're gonna look dumb. We're gonna make some major mistake. There's the classic Nova example, right? And you can cite a lot of these. So I think a good question to ask here is, how sensitive is my audience in this particular geography to English or whatever your source language is? Because obviously you want to avoid, terrible missteps, but you also want to avoid this sinkhole of diminishing returns. A good and valuable asset here I linked to is this English Proficiency Index, and they just released version 7 back in November of 2017. And this year the index ranked 80 countries and territories, and they took survey or test data actually of more than 1 million adults who took I think it's called the EF Standard English Test, the EF-SET, in 2016. So they took the actual test results of those folks, and then you can look at their site and compare the English proficiency level between any two countries. And that's a really great way of kind of getting a rough idea of like, okay, how sensitive are people to English and how much are they okay with it? How proficient are they? And then you can also correlate those stats by gender and age and internet access and R&D investment level. There's just a bunch of ways to slice and dice it. So pretty useful resource there. And, this mirrors what I heard in my conversations, right? So there are people that say, an online retailer I talked to said, the Dutch and Nordics tend to be very comfortable with English. I talked to someone who actually does localization for internal content at a telecom company. And he's like, we stopped doing all the different variants of Spanish for, Mexico and Spain and Latin America. We just went to one flavor of Spanish because that was sufficient. People were fine with it. Again, at the security software company, they're based in Canada, and they actually need French Canadian for the Quebecois, not just, mainstream France French. And so I asked, well, how did you know that? And my contact said, well, a great way to find out how sensitive people are is talk to your call center staff and say, which customers are like willing to converse in English and which one are really, going to be insistent on someone talking to them in their native language and even dialect. And that can be a great guide for where your particular customers are sensitive or not, because that's obviously it comes down to that question. So in this arena, the LSPs can really be a valuable partner to help, identify which elements have to be localized and which ones can be left in the source language. So this is from a case study from the GALA site. The link is at the bottom in the bit.ly link. And this group was working on localizing games into Russian. And so they put together this whole open document that has a bunch of specific examples of what should be translated and what is okay to leave untranslated. And it was based on, their local knowledge of just the culture. Also, they looked at customer feedback. But it was a great resource, right, to then help the developers and the content people to know what could be left in the source language and what had to be localized, because it's pretty expensive if you build your game with these strings in it, and maybe they even show up in the artwork, and they're not, they need to be localized or not. So the way this broke down really is the names of motorcycles that are made up names. It's okay to leave them in the source language, no big deal. But if you start talking about, a MiG-29, a Russian-made airplane, or a Russian-made weapon, well, that needs to be in the right characters set, or it's going to look really strange to users, to customers. So LSPs can be a great asset and aid here for figuring out those nuances of what really does need to be translated. So talking a little bit more about tiers and going a little bit deeper here, thinking about this by what type of content. So what type of content should get what type of treatment when you're localizing? So when I talked to the folks at King, he said, we invest really heavily in the high visibility content that's right along the decision workflows. So where someone is deciding whether to install, purchase, start using this app or not. So that includes things like app store listings and descriptions, screenshots, the what's new content, the initial onboarding, anything related to money. So, e-commerce cart, currency payment systems. So those really critical path places where the customer is deciding whether to continue or bail, those need the highest quality localization. A digital strategist for online retailers broke things into 3 tiers of content. She said you have kind of the site UI and your best-selling products. You got to nail those. And then, lesser selling products and things like your help content is sort of a second tier. And then you have this long tail of support articles and all that kind of stuff. And that can be just machine translated, and it's good enough. A localization management consultant talked about how, a lot of user-generated content ends up being machine translated, but the marketing content gets human translation. And then you have levels of QA that you can do, right? So add that into the mix. So really thinking about, again, what is that customer journey and how much volume is this content getting? So where on the customer journey is it, and how much volume does it get? Maybe a good guide for thinking about what to localize. This was drawn from a fantastic case study that I can't recommend enough. That was Alessandra Gobi from NetApp. And I just kind of created this simplified grid to show what's in the full case study. So you can see that if you follow the bit.ly link here. But if you think about it, really, there's this, the horizontal axis is volume, how much volume of content is produced. So low volume is branded stuff like, marketing content. And the highest volume is going to be, live chats and knowledge base articles, and then kind of in between. And then the vertical scale is, what is the QA model and what is the localization model? So what choices do you make, and how do you kind of mix and match to get the right combination that's going to get you what you need and not, again, get into this sense of diminishing returns. And so you can see that, kind of in the middle here at the left end, you might be human translation and maybe all the way up to 100% in terms of QA coverage for content. And then in the middle, you kind of have, a mix of human and machine, and you have some post-editing. You may only QA, kind of about to 50%. You're not going to kind of track down every single thing. As you go towards documentation and support, you might start just spot checking with your QA, and then with support, maybe it's just straight machine translation, and then where things get called out as confusing or off, then you just do editing on a kind of as needed basis. So a really helpful framework, I think, for thinking about how you might kind of take different approaches for different categories of content. Then I want to get into this last section of the talk, which is really about how do you measure success. So, we've talked a little bit about experimentation, but checking often to find out if your approach is working is so critical to know whether you should keep doing what you're doing or change direction, right? So we all want to know how to measure success better. One suggestion is just, asking staff and partners in the field, and then really listen. And so kind of channel your inner product manager, right? Be open and receptive. Don't be defensive, and just ask questions and ask why. and I think you'll dig in and find out the truth. And it may be super simple kinds of things, like, is it actually being used? I loved in her book, Anna Schlegel tells a story about how she was working localizing content for a particular marketing team. And she had just been taking in all the requests and just cranking out content. And she said, then I went to Europe and I sat with a number of field marketing directors. And in talking to them and them being more forthright, I realized that some of our programs were not even being used. Here's this localized content. It wasn't being marketed. It wasn't being sent to customers. It wasn't being used in any way. It had cost thousands of dollars to produce, and it was literally being put in the trash can on the other end. And so she tried to, raise a red flag, and it just didn't seem to be working. So she ended up just stopping a project from going through this kind of automated workflow and just said, nope, we're not going to do it. And then that got the attention of the VP right away, who said, hey, what's going on? The machine's broken. And she's like, well, yeah, but we need to adjust the machine. And so they ended up adjusting the program. But really it started with visiting the people at the other end out in the field and asking, is this working? Is it being used? What's your view of it? And then listening. So kind of moving to the next maturity level beyond that is what are your KPIs? So really getting your program owners and your GOs to agree on a core set of KPIs and then sit down and really do review them quarterly and see how you're tracking and decide how you need to adjust. So a very basic starting point here is just pull data on your content, so like Google Analytics or whatever you have, and just see what's getting traffic. And the things that are getting, if there's things that are getting, almost no traffic, then just ask, is it worth the investment? Should we still keep doing this? Is there a way we can cut back and reallocate that? As you get sort of more advanced, you may want to start thinking in terms of these two categories. And I pulled these from two sources. One is Cara Lindahl from Venga Global, who has a post, Counting What Counts. And it's linked in the slide at the end of this that has my kind of full set of resources. And then this book, Truly Global, by Anna Schlegel. So Anna, I think, provides some of the verbiage here around these two categories. Black box, which measures your process. It's basically things that your localization team cares about and probably not many other people care about, right? And so these are, how do I optimize the sausage making process? How do I get more efficient? How do I reduce costs? I mean, good things to think about, but sort of interest to a smaller group. And then this right column, these transparent outcomes, are more like business outcomes, right? These could be tied to revenue and to strategic goals at the highest level in the company. It's using these as how you're going to justify your localization investment to the C-suite. And so Schlegel really suggests choosing like 5 black box and 3 transparent metrics, whatever makes the most sense for you and your product and your team, and then measure those quarterly. And again, it doesn't have to be only quantifiable. I liked that, some of the ones she talked about is names of new global accounts that were landed because, you had localized content. And you can at least talk about how that was part of the conversation. So that's kind of a more qualitative or soft measure. But, when it's a big account and you can talk about how the content really played a factor in the perception of that customer, that's powerful. So picking these and then really optimizing around them and measuring them often. And I think when you get to kind of the ninja level, this is another case study from the GALA website. Again, highly recommend. It's a whole video of a presentation from a previous GALA event. And this group, Starwood, at the time was the name, Marriott Starwood, SPG, I think now. But anyway, they what they did is they came up with this whole sort of equation and to measure the return on ongoing translation spend. So the idea being, okay, so in the example that's here in the slide, do we really need a French localized experience for our property in Kansas City, Missouri? how many people who are French speaking or from French speaking geos do we get that are interested in coming to Kansas City? How many visits do we even get? And if it turns out that number is super small, and this equation kind of helps them calculate that, then stop doing French in Kansas City and do something else. So it's not about just doing less. It's actually about taking that investment and reallocating it in a place where it's going to be a bigger driver of growth for the company. And so they found that through doing this kind of on a large level, they found that about $300,000 that they could save, invest another $300,000 along with that. So take that $600,000, and they were expecting to maybe realize about $30 million in additional revenue. So at the time of the case study, they had some indication that things were really going in a good direction. But it's really this strategic approach of how can I take my investment and put it where it's going to have the maximum output and growth opportunity, and really keep optimizing there. So just to look back, what we talked about is really starting with strategy and a global strategy before you get into things like tactics around localization and efficiency. There are these many nuances, kind of these levers that you can pull around mixing, machine and human translation, and how much QA and checking you do. And then third is sort of this overarching theme here of experimenting and taking a lean approach to really figure out what's right for your audience, and talking to people in key roles like support, and talking to people in the field to find out what do we really need and where can we pull back, because it's all about balancing, the level of investment to maximize the return that you can get. Because if you don't do something in one area, you can put that somewhere else and get a better return. So one quick mention, I haven't talked about Snagit intentionally. Snagit is a product for taking screen content, screen captures, and images, and preparing those to be used in documentation, formal documentation, and also just showing people a series of steps to help them master some kind of a technical process or a piece of software. So we recently put in some new functionality so that if you have call-outs or markup in your images or your screenshots in your docs, you can actually extract out all those strings from the markup and the language strings into an XLIF file, get that translated, bring back the XLIF file, and when you bring it back into Snagit, Snagit will duplicate all those original screenshots and plug in your translated text. So there's a demo you can see at that link if that's interesting to you. Feel free to hit me up on email with questions. Here are my references. So that's here in the deck that I'll post. And here's my contact information. Happy to answer questions either about the talk, things that we're doing at TechSmith, or things about the product. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or email, and would love to follow up with anyone who's interested.